You don't remember the first time the internet entered your life. You remember the feeling, that low-level hum that something had shifted, even if you couldn't name it yet. One day, the world was finite, slow, physical. The next, it had windows, not doors, windows. And you were a teenager leaning through them, half inside childhood, half staring into a future that hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. That moment, that in-between state, quietly shaped how you think, love, trust, cope, and even how you sit alone with your thoughts today. If you were a teen in the 1990s, your psychology doesn't quite fit the boxes people try to put it in now. You're not nostalgic in the soft, sentimental way people assume. And you're not cynical in the sharp, detached way you sometimes get labeled as either. You're something stranger than that. You're a bridge generation. And living your whole life as a bridge does something subtle to a person. You grew up with boredom that was real. The kind that didn't get solved by scrolling. You stared at walls. You laid on the floor listening to the same song on repeat because that's all you had. You waited for phone calls, for letters, for your favorite show to come on at a specific time. Waiting wasn't a flaw back then. It was a skill you didn't know you were developing. And that patience wired something deep into you. Even now, when everything is instant, part of you still expects life to take time. And another part of you feels oddly exhausted by how fast everything has become. There's a reason people from that era often feel overstimulated, but underfulfilled at the same time. Your nervous system was calibrated in an analog world and then dropped into a digital one without consent or instruction. You learned emotional regulation before algorithms learned how to manipulate attention. That matters. You remember when privacy was default, when embarrassing moments faded instead of being archived. So now, living in a world that never forgets, you feel exposed in ways you can't always articulate, not paranoid, just watched, even when no one is watching. You learned identity slowly. You tried on personalities in real rooms, with real consequences. If you said something stupid, it echoed for a while, but it didn't follow you forever. That allowed experimentation without permanent branding. Compare that to now, where people curate themselves before they even know who they are. That's why you tend to be suspicious of overly polished self-presentation. You can smell when something is performative. You trust people more when they're a little awkward, a little unfinished, because that's how everyone was when you were figuring yourself out. Music wasn't background noise. It was a place. You didn't just listen to it. You lived inside it. Songs became emotional containers for things you didn't have language for yet. Angst wasn't a phase. It was a processing tool. And because of that, you still use art as a way to metabolize emotion rather than escape it. You don't just want something that feels good. You want something that feels honest. That's why you're drawn to stories with rough edges, flawed characters, unresolved endings. You're comfortable with ambiguity. You grew up in it. You also grew up before constant validation. No likes, no instant feedback loops telling you whether you mattered that day. Praise was rarer, criticism more direct. That did two contradictory things to you. On one hand, you developed a strong internal compass. You learned to ask yourself, do I like this? Instead of waiting for confirmation. On the other hand, you carry a quiet hunger for recognition you don't always admit. Not attention, recognition. Being seen for who you actually are, not just what you produce. Relationships, for you, are complicated in a very specific way. You crave depth, but you're wary of intensity that feels manufactured. You learned intimacy through proximity, not constant communication. Long gaps between conversations didn't mean abandonment. They meant life was happening. So now, when relationships demand constant availability, part of you feels smothered, even if you care deeply. You don't fall in love fast, but when you do, it's serious. You don't bond through constant updates. You bond through shared silence, shared history, shared struggle. Conflict shaped you differently too. You couldn't just block someone and erase them. If something went wrong, you still had to see that person at school, at work, in your neighborhood. Avoidance wasn't an option. Resolution mattered, or at least endurance did. That's why you have a higher tolerance for discomfort in relationships. You don't immediately run at the first sign of tension. You try to understand it, sit with it, sometimes longer than you should. And yes, that can turn into staying too long in situations that drain you. But it also means you don't treat people as disposable. There's a specific kind of resilience that comes from growing up when the future felt promising but undefined. You were told things would work out if you tried hard enough, but no one handed you a map. That created both hope and pressure. You internalized the idea that if things didn't work, it was somehow your fault. That belief still lingers. Even now, when systems are clearly broken, you're more likely to blame yourself than the structure around you. You call it accountability. Sometimes it's just unnecessary self-punishment. You also witnessed the shift from optimism to irony in real time. You watched sincerity become uncool, then slowly watched people crave it again. So you developed humor as armor. Sarcasm wasn't just wit, it was self-protection. Saying you didn't care before someone else could dismiss you, laughing first so it wouldn't hurt as much. And while you've matured beyond that instinct in many ways, it still shows up when you feel emotionally exposed. A joke, a deflection, a half smile instead of a full confession. Technology didn't raise you, but it trained you later. And that late adoption is why you use it differently. You don't confuse connection with closeness as easily. You know the difference between talking and being understood. You remember life before constant updates. So silence doesn't scare you the way it scares some people. At the same time, you feel a quiet grief for the simplicity that's gone. Not because it was perfect, but because it felt human in a way that's harder to access now. You carry memories that are tactile, the weight of a phone receiver, the click of a cassette, the static of a TV late at night. Those sensory experiences anchored you in your body. So when life becomes too abstract, too virtual, too optimized, you feel disconnected in a way that's almost physical. That's why you're drawn to nostalgia that isn't glossy. You don't want the highlight reel. You want the texture, the imperfections, the proof that things were real. Authority, for you, has always been questionable. You grew up watching institutions present certainty and then quietly fail. That didn't make you rebellious for the sake of it. It made you discerning. You respect competence, not titles, integrity, not confidence. And you're allergic to people who speak in absolutes. You know how quickly absolutes age. Emotionally, you're layered. You can hold joy and sadness at the same time without needing to resolve the contradiction. That's not accidental. It comes from growing up in a world that wasn't constantly explaining itself to you. You learn to infer, to read between lines, to feel your way through uncertainty. That's why you're often the person others come to when things get complicated. You don't rush to fix, you listen. You sit with people in the mess. But here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Being a bridge is exhausting. You're constantly translating between generations, between values, between speeds of life. You remember how things were, you understand how things are, and you're not entirely comfortable in either place. That can make you feel invisible, like you don't fully belong anywhere. Too old for the new world's chaos, too young for its nostalgia to feel settled. That invisibility can turn into self-doubt if you're not careful. You might downplay your experiences because they don't fit the current narrative. You might feel behind, even when you've lived through more transitions than most. But your value was never in keeping up. It was in understanding change without losing yourself inside it. You're not broken because you feel tired by constant reinvention. You're not outdated because you prefer depth over speed. And you're not failing because the rules you were given no longer apply. You adapted once already. That's in your bones. But adaptation doesn't mean erasure. It means integration. The psychology of being a teen in the 1990s is the psychology of someone who learned how to be alone before learning how to be connected. Someone who understands that identity is something you build, not something you broadcast. Someone who knows that meaning takes time and that not everything worth having can be optimized. If you sometimes feel like you're carrying an invisible weight, it's because you are. You're holding memories of a slower world while navigating a faster one. That tension doesn't mean you're stuck. It means you're aware. And awareness, even when it's uncomfortable, is a form of quiet power. You don't need to chase relevance. You already lived through relevance changing its mind. What you have is perspective. And in a world addicted to immediacy, perspective is rare. It's steady. It's grounding. It doesn't shout. But it lasts. And maybe that's the real legacy of growing up when you did. You learned that life isn't about constant peaks. It's about continuity, showing up, paying attention, letting things unfold, and trusting that even if the world keeps changing, the parts of you that learned how to wait, how to feel, how to think deeply, those parts still know what they're doing.